Welcome, everybody. Welcome to SynerComm's IT Trendsetters. Today's topic is lessons learned from hybrid/multi-cloud deployments. Today, we are talking with Kirk and Aaron from SynerComm. So before we get started, Kirk, I think everyone of our listeners probably already knows you, so I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk. But let's first hear from Aaron. Aaron, tell us, our listeners, a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm Aaron Howell, managing consultant for the MultiCloud and architecture and innovations team. We'll talk a little bit more about what that actually means, but basically SynerComm identified that there was a need for our clients to be able to help them more like guideposts within the cloud. So we developed this team around the cloud architecture, as well as automation, orchestration, all those pieces. A little bit about myself. I love problem solving. I do puzzles all the time, and I really enjoy just that boost of confidence when you finish a problem that you really haven't solved before, and that really translates not only into what I do on my pastime, but also what I do for SynerComm.
So I was looking at your LinkedIn, and it looks like you do quite a bit with the Boy Scouts of America. Are you an Eagle Scout?
I'm not an Eagle Scout. I'm what they call a lifer. That being said, I have done assistant scoutmaster supports with them. I was senior patrol leader back when I was in Boy Scouts, so I had almost all the merit badges. It was just completing it out.
Very cool. Kirk.
Hey.
So tell us something that we don't know about you. We've talked a lot. So tell us something that nobody knows about yourself.
Well, the big one now, my latest hobby is playing around with cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin and altcoins. And I've got a mentor that was a CTO at a large organization, and he's been giving me some tips and tricks, but he's made it very clear I should treat that like I'm going to Vegas. If I do well, I do well. If I lose it, it's not financial advice from him.
Yeah. So have you been playing with the NFTs?
The non-fungible tokens?
Yeah.
A little bit. Yep. So it's
that is
an interesting process to see, and I'm learning all kinds of terms like fiat money, which is US dollars, and crypto money, and where's this all going to play out with the Federal Reserves and the central banks of all the different countries. And so it's a fun little hedge of the bets, I guess, against inflation at some point.
It is definitely a very interesting topic, and on my my entrepreneur Slack channels, that's all we're talking about right now. So it's definitely a lot to learn there. I might be buying my own virtual land soon. All right, so let's get started. So let's get back to the basics. I mean, I've been around for a while. I'm not a technical person, but I've been hearing a lot about this multi-cloud, and it just like it's a marketing speak for a lot of these technology companies like yourself. So could you kind of dumb this down? And so what does hybrid and multi-cloud really mean?
All right. Well, for a high level definition, I'll start, and we'll let Aaron put all the devils in the details for us. But at a high level, you've got your hybrid cloud, which is really a combination of different cloud types. We'd have either a hosting center or your data center tied in with a public cloud. And then a multi-cloud could be all of that, but also like a public data center and a public data center where you choose to run an application across or between multiple public clouds. Aaron, could we have a little more definition to that? But that's about as high level as I can make it. Aaron, maybe you'll give a little more detail on that.
Yeah, as I was doing research into what multi-cloud is versus what hybrid cloud was, and they kind of go hand in hand when you really think about it. But hybrid cloud normally is understood as something where you connect the public cloud to your on-premise network. When you go into multi-cloud, you're looking at one or two different public clouds, but you also might include your on-premise network. So really what it comes down to is how is your applications actually connecting through the cloud services. So a multi-cloud infrastructure is normally known as kind of that apples to apples comparison, where you have the same application running in multiple different clouds, and they're all interconnected They all have like that fault tolerance, redundancy, those kind of things. Where when you're looking at the hybrid cloud, you're really looking at that apples to oranges, where you might have different services running in each environment, but they're still working together as a whole. So those are kind of the terms that I've seen. And I have also noticed that multi-cloud is more of a marketing strategy, where hybrid cloud has been kind of understood by the industry as a true term for a build process in the cloud.
So multi-cloud to me sounds extremely complicated. And I would imagine that it is very complicated to simplify your network. So talk to me about, I mean, in your experience, talk to me about some of the gotchas that you've run into.
Absolutely. So we've seen a lot of customers starting to migrate towards the cloud. We've seen them being able to leverage some or more of their services as they've started to understand. But what you start to notice and what happens is that those services that you used 6 months ago or a year ago might have been replaced by other more cost-effective services, services that might just work a little bit better for what your application was. So instead of just trying to force something in, now they've actually got a support structure. A great example of that is AWS. A while ago, they had a lot of customers creating what they called the transient networks. Transient networks are basically that hub and spoke network, where you've got all your traffic coming into the one area, and then it's kind of bleeding out into different accounts or different segments of the network, and then they're all coming back through. That way you've got centralized security, you've got centralized logging, those kind of things. Well, AWS identified that this was a need a couple of years ago, and they actually created a service that you could just spin up what they called their transient gateway, where you could plug in those security tools already in the services. You didn't have to create your own transient gateway. So that's just one example of what we've seen, and it happens time and time again with the cloud.
And I guess at a high level, I think that was just a great example that Aaron brought up about really the devil is in the details, and some of the value that an organization like us can bring to the table is two things. One is the full cloud, the full stack engineer, where they've thought through all the different levels of the OSI/IP stack model, but also having that inherent security practices that we have, and some of the tools that we have, like our Chasm tool that's continuously discovering your attack surface. So as you have some of your attack surface from the internet, could be in your data center, a hosting center, multiple public clouds, we can help you keep an eye on that. And also having the full stack engineers, SynerComm being around for 30 years, we can help you with a lot of those gray areas that may not have been thought out about, like people that are just used to cloud native components.
Talk to me about costs. I mean, I know some of the benefits of these types of architectures is flexibility. When I hear that, I think, oh boy, like how do I roll? What are my costs going to be on a regular basis? And then the other part of my question is, I see lots of different organizations, and I would think that a lot of IT organizations are still fairly siloed. So how does that play in this whole mix?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. A lot of organizations are siloed, and that's when you start seeing the cloud and you start seeing those different services, those microservices, how they're integrating to each other. You start to see that you're needing more of those specialty expertise in different areas that maybe you weren't looking at before. You got, of course, your application builders, but then you have architecture, you have the security logging, really anything that you had on-prem. But the thing with the cloud is that they all integrate everything together. So you really do need to understand more of those controls that are being put in place at the service level than you would have to if you were just doing on-prem, because normally what happens is that security would come in, let's say, and give you like a shim or something to put into your application, rather than now you're, as the application owner, have to understand what security pieces to put in place and what are the best practices to do. So we see a lot of just kind of that collapsing, and as Kirk mentioned before, that full stack engineer being needed. to be able to understand your application from beginning to end. Even if you are just a minor owner, you might be affected later down the line in the application pipeline. So those are just some of the things, as well as costs associated. What we like to tell our customers is that if you're planning on doing just a one-to-one migration, you're probably not going to see a total cost benefit at that time. You're just going to be moving VMs. You might be able to decentralize maybe a couple applications, but if you're just moving data center to data center, what's going to happen is your costs are still going to raise in your original data center, and then you're going to raise your costs in cloud. Now, what you have to do is you have to then remove your tech debt in one area, your on-prem, and then as you do that, you're probably going to see a more exponential growth. The cloud does offer some pieces that help, like reserved instances where you can basically pay upfront for those computing resources if you're looking at that for the VMs. But really what comes with cost benefit is when you start removing that server layer and bringing them into the serverless environment, or bringing them into those Kubernetes clusters, or any of those pieces where it's really cloud centric, and you're not managing Linux, or you're not managing Windows anymore, you're managing your application. Everything else is being taken care of in the background. That's where you're going to see a best cost benefit. And of course, then when you start visualizing the costs of seeing your traffic going, because you're being cost every time you send traffic, anytime you send packets through, you're going to start seeing a total amount of cost higher than what you would have seen in your data center. But that's just because the visibility wasn't there before. The cloud has a really good way of understanding exactly what you're costing them in terms of packet per packet flow. And that's when you're going to start seeing your costs rise. But again, if you start using those cloud native services, those cloud native applications, those ones that kind of integrate less compute cost, you're able to then really benefit from the cloud's costs.
I want to follow up on that. A quick follow up on that, Aaron, is what about assigning of the security ownership between the DevOps teams, the cloud teams, the security teams? Any comments on what you're speaking of silos? That's lots of different silos. Security has a tendency to go horizontal, but what are you seeing organizations doing for security?
So what we've seen with security is that you'll create basically these controls around the application services. And then what you then do is basically templatize that and then send that off to your application owners so that they're then able to basically make sure that they're in compliance with what your security team has done, but it's going to be applied directly on them. You're no longer sitting at the highest level of the network waiting to get all this information. It's really going to be integrated down into the application level. And so I've seen with successes, the best successes that I've seen is that they create these templates basically for the different services. They analyze the services, understand what the best practices are. How does that conform to the company's understanding of security and what they then adopt as their model, and then send that down to the application owners, which then really increase their security overall, make sure that they don't lose any logs, because that's always a big factor, and then be able to report on anything that is coming up, being able to actionize it, potentially even be able to automate some of these responses. A great example of that is AWS as well as Azure has the ability to host public files, right? And so they're accessible throughout the public internet, but you don't always want to be able to turn that on. So some companies just basically say, hey, if you try to flip that switch is automatically flipped off unless you have, authorization through that to be able to turn that on, and then they create exceptions. So just some of those things of being able to avoid those missed check marks, those slider switches, because it's so easy to provision things, the security definitely has to come into play. Otherwise, you might be opening yourself to a breach or potential leak of information that you didn't even know.
And how do you take your cloud team and then you have your security team, which is used to things like your traditional firewalls, your Palo Altos, your checkpoints, and how do you integrate where you would, with who makes the decision, the cloud team on what kind of firewalling they want, or the people that are responsible for the security in the organization?
Yeah, that's a question that I've worked with a couple clients to really understand the security level and the detail and who really has the ownership. So normally when you're going into the cloud, you create what you call the Cloud Center of Excellence. Cloud Center of Excellence is normally subject matter experts. One is normally security, of course, application understanding, database, if you guys are supporting that, as well as networking. So there's a couple different key players that are in that Cloud Center of Excellence. And then as you start to develop through the cloud, you then rely on those SMEs to be able to understand that, that application or what you're going to be doing. And I really think that overall the company is going to, refine and understand exactly what kind of security that they're looking for, especially if they're moving something from on-prem. They already have a standard of what they're thinking of. So really it's being able to put those security services in place. So you have a lot of ability, of course, with VMs and instances where you can put in third-party vendors, which then adds, of course, complexity, but it also might add a sense of security. You might already have that security vendor in place already, so you can then integrate it into more of your on-prem solution. So you're in still that one pane of glass, and being able to then actionalize those security events. That's really what it comes down to, being able to not only identify and report, but being able to take those actions against it, be it if you're sending it over to a ticketing system or if you're, again, using automation orchestration. But the security standpoint really needs to be defined from the organization and then filtered into the teams that are then utilizing the cloud.
So let's take this full circle. That's a lot of information, and I appreciate all that thought leadership and knowledge. But let's talk about some real world use cases. Obviously, let's keep the customers' names private, but can we talk through some of the use cases that you guys have worked on with your customers?
Yeah, I mean, what I've got a ton of examples. The one that really comes to mind was there was a customer who had an issue. They created this great architecture in the cloud. They had this beautiful design. They were doing SD-WAN. They were creating, it was AWS, so they were doing EC2 instances. They were basically creating this whole public accessible applications through these security devices. And the security vendor, unfortunately, wasn't supporting a full HA environment through the cloud, through AWS at this time. So when we first were engaged with them, we identified that right away, that there was a shortcoming in their design work. They went off for a couple of weeks and actually came back to us, and we started sitting down with their engineering. We sat down with their cloud team, and we started to understand exactly what they were looking for. And they were looking for HA, but in particular, they were looking for failover of what's EIP, external or elastic IPs, which are basically external IPs, as well as being able to then fail over their SD-WAN tunnels that they had, which were SSL VPN at the time. So what we did is we integrated, because of the vendor, we were able to integrate these checks with them that were able to then trigger an API gateway within AWS. That API gateway then tied to a serverless environment that would then trigger the failover, not only for the security vendor devices, but actually use the API for their SD-WAN to be able to identify that the tunnel needed to be shut down, and then they would fail over to the other tunnel, as well as moving those EIPs across the different EC2 instances and basically activating that passive firewall. So even though they thought that they weren't even connected via the vendor through that HA connection, what they were able to do is work as a unit to be able to configure themselves, be able to run with the actual configuration of the other one. And then what we did is we created a API connection as well that made it possible for the organization to be able to only configure the one device, and then it would actually spread the config across the other device. So that way, if there was any changes, that was always being synced up. So if someone forgot that, oh, there's another firewall, even though it wasn't in the vendor's, single pane of glass like connection, that it would still be able to be synced. And then during that failover time, they would be able to, and it would be an automatic failover, of course, being able to fail over and having the latest config on there ready to go. So that way they had no performance impact.
That's a great example of having a team like Aaron's that have got all kinds of experiences with the full stack type of things and the newer features of like functions and things like that, leveraging all those to pull all that together to do things that you can't make work by just one piece of it. At the time, you had to have the capabilities of the Amazon cloud, the capabilities of the firewall vendor, the capabilities of the network, and the application all have to move back and forth in sync, and that is not trivial. And that's we're someone like ourselves that has not only that, but also security expertise that can bring a lot of value to the table.
Yeah, and another interesting point about that one was we were asked to code the serverless environment in a very particular scripting language, PowerShell, because that was what the customer understood the best. So we actually had to basically ramp our team up. We had PowerShell expertise, but really doing that in the service environment, that was a different step. And we were able to make it so the customer was able to manage their code without our support because they understood PowerShell the best.
In an AWS environment?
In an AWS environment.
So it sounds to me like there's a lot of tribal knowledge that comes from just your experience here. And is it safe to say that most of the companies that are moving to this type of environment, they need a third party to come in, or how much of this can they handle on their own?
Normally, when we see people who have kind of started the migration in the cloud, they understand kind of the vision of where they want to go. Sometimes they even get to the point of architecting, building. And there has been use cases that we've come in where it's fully architected and there's a problem that it was, unfortunately, a service was misunderstood, or there was something where it was just a gotcha in the service that it just doesn't work the way they expected it to. So I would say that it definitely is some tribal knowledge that is needed, or training. Of course, with any of these cloud services, they have great training, and I highly suggest anyone who's interested to take that training because it really does give you a better understanding. We've had gotchas where someone has basically tried to put in a security vendor product and then didn't realize at the time that there was a different underlay network that was running between the cloud. And so they thought that they were able to move all of their serverless environment communications, all that through a defined virtual network. But what it turned out to be is that there were actually hardware pieces that could be allocated called the integration service gateways, and this is in Azure, that you can make that communication happen. However, forcing it through a third-party vendor on a VM it just wasn't optimal for their performance. So what we did is we analyzed a little bit more about that, and then we created a full mesh network that they were able to not only keep their security vendor intact, but being able to communicate through those devices, being able to monitor their traffic and analyze that using, again, that third-party vendor, which brings them more of that security expertise than some of the cloud services have to offer.
So let's wrap up this conversation by talking a little bit about the future. What does the future really look like? And I'm really thinking 5 to 10 years out. Sorry, that's my Alexa.
I'll start with a high level one, and I'll let Aaron give you a little more granular detail. And some of this is from our experiences with Juniper Network and their recent acquisition of Mist, but I think they're right on target there with moving from the world of device management and network protocol management, basically, to user experience management and session, and what data do I need to manage user experience. So starting to collect things and watch things like latency around session IDs and how long databases take to respond. So I think you're going to see a lot of movement, especially as you start having an application, like Aaron said, that could be in your data center in multiple clouds. How do you know if you're doing well or not? And ultimately it's the user application experience. So I think with all the clouds have a lot of the ML, machine learning and AI tools, and they can identify things based on thresholds. So I think you're really going to see that world. And then on the security side of that, you're going to see more of the trust but verify moving to the kind of zero trust when possible at certain gateways, so that you can limit your exposure also. So those two things, user experience and zero trust together, and that's the security and the full stack things that we bring to the table.
Yeah, and I kind of view it as we've seen this going over the past couple of years, is that decentralizing of services, being able to split apart different services. No longer are we really supporting monolithic structures. We're really looking at applications that are agile. They can be changed very quickly. And I think that's going to continue to change. And we've seen that not only in the decentralization of compute, but we also see that in just the startup companies that are out there. They really do decentralize, and it's really that just-in-time delivery. I think we're going to see more trends keep going with that. And then as these compute services get cheaper, as we think of the services that are offered, I was thinking about this today. The ability for me as a company, I can use Amazon satellite links now to be able to send out my application and utilize those to the fullest. So being able to have access to resources that I never even would have dreamed of. Quantum computing, I can play with a quantum computer now in the cloud services. And I don't have to have, $1 million plus or however much it is to just even get started in that realm. So I can start looking at probability factors. So I think that by giving these services and the ability to get clients and to get companies in that have access to those, you're going to see a lot more utilization of the artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computing, all those buzzwords that we talk about now, but they're really going to become part of our day-to-day lives as we go forward. And I think that being able to access those resources, we're just going to have so much more just choices to be able to, for things that compete with each other and being able to understand it. But I also think that we might get nickel and dime to death after a while, because we're going to have so many different services that we're paying for.
Yeah. All right. So last question I have before we wrap this up, as with all these interviews that I do a little research beforehand, and I noticed that SynerComm has been in the news lately, winning a few awards. So Kirk, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, two recently. One is, I mentioned before, Juniper Networks. We're actually their overall North American Partner of the Year. So that means between all of their trades, the service provider, the enterprise, all the different pieces that they handle, security, we're actually overall Partner of the Year, and that is comes in many flavors, not just also being able to move a lot of solutions, but also having the depth to actually support the solutions and having resources to do that and be aligned with the security component also, which is very important going forward. That, and then also our new application that we're developing called the Chasm, or the Continuous Attack Surface Management engine that's continuously scanning the enterprise based on companies' domain information, their IP ranges, any SaaS applications. We're basically as a finalist in the vulnerability and pen testing category of Secure Computing Magazine's annual security awards group.
Very cool. Well, congratulations. Well deserved, it sounds like. Aaron, appreciate your time today. Kirk, always a pleasure. You are listening to SynerComm's IT Trendsetters.